It doesn't start with a problem. It starts with a thought. Small, quiet, easy to ignore. But once it's there, it doesn't leave the same way. Doubt doesn't always arrive loudly. For an avoidance system, it builds slowly, internally, almost silently. Because in the beginning, everything can feel clear, natural, uncomplicated. They're present, engaged, open enough to experience the connection. But then, something shifts, not outside, inside. A thought appears, uninvited. Is this right? And that question doesn't come from something obvious. No conflict, no clear issue, just a feeling they can't fully place. And that feeling starts the process. Because once the question exists, the mind begins to look for answers, not in a grounded way, in a searching way, scanning the connection for something. That explains the discomfort. And when there's no clear answer, the mind creates one. Subtly, this feels too easy. This feels different. This feels off. Not because it is, because something internally doesn't feel settled. And instead of recognizing that internal shift, it gets projected onto the connection. So now, the connection becomes the focus, the thing to analyze, to understand, to question. And that's where overthinking begins. Not as a choice, as a response, a way to make sense of a feeling that doesn't match what's happening. Because from the outside, everything is fine, nothing is broken, nothing is wrong. But internally, something feels uncertain. And uncertainty doesn't sit quietly. It searches, it evaluates, it tries to resolve itself. So they start replaying moments, looking back at conversations, at reactions, at small details that didn't stand out before. Now everything gets reviewed, not because they want to doubt, because they're trying to find certainty, trying to understand why something doesn't feel as clear as it did before. And in that process, neutral moments start to shift. A simple response feels different. A pause feels more noticeable. A tone gets interpreted more deeply, not accurately, just more intensely. Because once the mind is looking for meaning, it finds it, even where there isn't much. And that creates a loop. Thought leads to analysis. Analysis leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to more doubt. And more doubt feeds the need to think again. And slowly, the connection stops feeling simple, stops feeling easy. Not because it changed, because it's being experienced differently, through a layer of questioning instead of presence. And that layer creates distance, not physical, mental, emotional. They're still there, still engaging, still responding. But part of them is elsewhere, observing, analyzing, trying to understand what they're feeling. And that split changes everything. Because you can't fully experience something while questioning it at the same time. So the connection loses something. Not closeness, ease, that natural flow that existed before the doubt. Because now every moment passes through a filter. Does this feel right? Does this match what I want? Why does this feel different? And those questions don't resolve quickly. They build quietly, consistently, until the connection feels heavier than it actually is, more complicated than it needs to be. Not because of what's happening, because of how much is being thought about. And that's what makes this kind of doubt so powerful. It doesn't come from reality. It comes from interpretation, from trying to make sense of something internal by analyzing something external. And the more that happens, the further they move away from the experience itself, from the feeling that was once simple, from the clarity that didn't need to be questioned, until eventually they're no longer just in the connection. They're inside, their thoughts about it. And once that shift happens, the doubt is no longer just a thought. It becomes the experience. Once that doubt takes hold, it doesn't stay as one thought. It multiplies quietly, systematically, because now the mind has a direction. It's no longer just feeling. It's searching, looking for confirmation, looking for patterns, looking for anything that supports the question that started it all. And when the mind starts searching like that, it doesn't stay neutral. It leans. It begins to notice what fits the doubt, not what contradicts it. So small things, things that once felt insignificant, start to carry weight. A delayed reply, a slight change in tone, a moment that feels a little less expressive. Before, these moments would pass. Now, they get stored, examined, connected, because the mind is building a case, not intentionally, automatically, trying to create clarity out of uncertainty. And the more it collects, the more the doubt feels valid, not because it's accurate, because it's supported by selective attention. And that's when the shift deepens, because now they're not just questioning the connection, they're starting to feel differently inside it, less relaxed, less open, less immersed, because part of them is always thinking, always monitoring, always evaluating. And that constant mental activity creates distance, not visible distance, internal distance. They begin to hold their responses a little more. Think before expressing. Filter what they feel, not because they don't want to be open, because they're unsure what they feel. And when someone is unsure, they don't expand, they contain. So instead of flowing naturally, they start managing how they show up, reducing intensity, reducing spontaneity, reducing emotional exposure. And each of those reductions creates a subtle shift in the connection, because what you feel is not their doubt, it's their adjustment, the way they become slightly more distant without leaving, slightly more reserved without withdrawing. And that difference is hard to explain, because everything still looks the same. They're still there, still talking, still engaging, but something feels different, less warm, less easy, less natural. And that's because you're no longer experiencing pure presence. You're experiencing presence mixed with hesitation, presence mixed with analysis, presence mixed with doubt. And that mixture changes the energy, because doubt doesn't stay internal. It influences behavior. It shapes tone. It alters timing. It affects how much someone gives. And over time, that influence becomes more visible. They start pulling back slightly more, not in big ways, in small, consistent ones. They don't go as deep in conversations. They don't express as freely. They don't respond with the same openness, because internally, they are no longer certain how they feel. And uncertainty creates caution. Caution creates distance. And distance feeds the doubt, because now the connection actually starts to feel different. Not because it began that way, because it was shaped by the doubt that came first. And that's what makes this cycle so powerful. It creates the very thing it's questioning. The doubt changes behavior. The behavior changes the experience. The experience confirms the doubt. And the cycle continues quietly, consistently, without needing a real problem to exist. And as that cycle continues, they move further into their thoughts, further away from the actual connection, because thinking feels safer than feeling. Thinking creates distance. Distance creates control, and control restores something their system relies on: stability. Even if that stability comes from stepping back internally. And as they step back, they become more observant, more analytical, more focused on understanding instead of experiencing. And that shift changes everything because now the connection is no longer something they're in. It's something they're evaluating. And evaluation doesn't create closeness, it creates separation, a subtle gap between them and what they're feeling. Because instead of trusting the experience, they're questioning it constantly. And over time, that constant questioning becomes exhausting mentally, emotionally, because nothing ever settles. Nothing feels fully clear. Every moment leads to another thought, another question, another layer of analysis, until the connection feels heavier than it actually is, more complicated than it needs to be, and that heaviness becomes associated with the connection itself, not the thinking, the connection, because that's what they're focused on. So instead of recognizing, I'm overthinking this, it becomes, this feels like too much. This doesn't feel right. This feels complicated. And that interpretation pushes them further into distance. Because now, stepping back feels like relief. Relief from the thinking. Relief from the uncertainty. Relief from the internal tension. Even if the tension was never caused by the connection itself. And that's how something that started as a quiet thought becomes a full experience. Something that felt simple becomes something that feels heavy. Something that felt easy becomes something that feels unclear. Not because it changed, because it was overprocessed. And once that pattern is active, it doesn't stop on its own, because the mind keeps trying to resolve what it started. Even if the resolution never comes through thinking, even if the clarity was only ever available through feeling. And the more they stay in their thoughts, the further they move from that clarity until eventually the doubt no longer feels like a question. It feels like the truth. As that doubt settles in, it stops feeling like something they're questioning and starts feeling like something they're realizing. Not because it's true, because it's been repeated enough, thought after thought, moment after moment, until the mind no longer sees it as a possibility, but as a conclusion. This doesn't feel right. And once a thought becomes a conclusion, everything begins to organize around it. Perception shifts, attention narrows, meaning changes, because now they're not looking to understand, they're looking to confirm. And confirmation is powerful. It turns uncertainty into belief, even if that belief was built on misinterpretation. So now, they begin to experience the connection through that belief, not through what's actually happening, through what they've decided it means. And that changes everything. Because once something feels not right, every moment is filtered through that feeling. A simple silence feels heavier. A neutral response feels distant. A normal pause feels intentional. Not because those things changed, because the meaning assigned to them did. And meaning shapes experience. So the connection begins to feel less safe, less certain, less aligned, even if nothing externally has shifted, because internally everything has. And that internal shift starts to affect how they show up. They become less emotionally available, not suddenly, gradually. They begin to hold back more, think more, feel less, not because they want to disconnect, because they're trying to stay in control of what they're experiencing. Because now the connection doesn't feel simple, it feels loaded, full of meaning, full of questions that haven't been answered. And when something feels loaded, the natural response is to reduce how much you engage with it. So they do. They start creating space, not dramatically, subtly, less initiation, less depth, less emotional expression. And each of those changes creates distance, not enough to break the connection, but enough to change how it feels. Because now you're not experiencing the same level of presence, the same openness, the same ease. And that difference becomes noticeable, even if it's not clear what caused it. And naturally, you respond. You feel the shift, the reduction, the subtle distance, and you try to reconnect, to understand, to bring things back to how they were. But that response, even if it's gentle, adds pressure, not intentional pressure, emotional pressure, because now they feel seen, not in a grounding way, in a way that makes them more aware of the disconnect, more aware that something has changed, more aware that they don't fully understand why. And that awareness amplifies the doubt, because now it's not just internal, it's reflected in the dynamic, in how you respond, in how you try to reconnect, in how the energy shifts between you. And that reflection feels like confirmation. Something is off, even if the original cause was internal, even if the doubt created the shift. Now the shift feels real, observable, mutual, and that's where the cycle deepens. Because what started as overthinking has now shaped the experience itself. And once the experience feels different, the doubt feels justified, not questioned, justified. And from that point, they move further into certainty, not healthy certainty, protective certainty, the kind that says, I need space, I need to step back, this isn't right. Not because those statements are grounded in truth, because they resolve the discomfort, they reduce the overthinking, they create distance from the internal tension. And distance feels like clarity, even when it's not, even when it's just relief. Relief from the noise of constant analysis, relief from trying to understand something that was never meant to be solved through thinking. And that relief reinforces the decision, because stepping back feels better than staying in confusion. So the mind links the two. Distance equals right decision, even if the discomfort came from within, even if the connection was never the actual problem. And that's how the pattern completes itself. A thought becomes doubt, doubt becomes analysis, analysis becomes interpretation, interpretation becomes belief, belief changes behavior, behavior changes the experience, and the experience confirms the belief, until what started as a quiet question ends as a firm conclusion. And once that conclusion is in place, it feels real, solid, justified, even if it was built on something that was never fully understood. And unless that pattern is seen clearly, it repeats. Every time they start overthinking, every time a small feeling turns into a question, every time the mind tries to solve what can only be felt, because the issue was never the connection, it was the way they moved away from it and into their thoughts. And once that shift happens, everything changes. When you finally see this pattern, everything stops feeling random, because now you're not looking at isolated moments. You're seeing a sequence, a progression, how something small quietly grows into something that feels certain, not because it was clear, because it was repeated. And once you understand that, you stop trying to fix the ending. You stop focusing on the distance, on the shift, on what changed at the surface. Because now you see, the change didn't start there. It started with a thought, a quiet doubt that wasn't recognized for what it was. And because it wasn't recognized, it was followed, analyzed, expanded, until it shaped everything that came after. And that clarity changes how you relate to it. You stop asking, "What did I do?" to make them pull away. You stop replaying your words, your tone, your timing, trying to find the exact moment. Something went wrong because now you understand. It wasn't a moment. It was a process, internal, gradual, unspoken, and most of it happened without you even being part of it. Because overthinking doesn't need external triggers. It feeds on internal uncertainty, on feelings that don't make sense right away, on discomfort that doesn't have a clear source. And when those feelings aren't understood, they get turned into questions. And those questions slowly become beliefs. And once they become beliefs, they feel real, even if they started from something unclear. And that's why this pattern is so confusing to experience. Because from your side, it feels like something changed between you. But from their side, it feels like something became clear within them. Even if that clarity came from misinterpretation, even if it was built through overthinking, and that mismatch between your experience and theirs is where the disconnect lives. Because you're responding to what's happening between you, and they're responding to what's happening inside them. And those two things don't always align, especially when their internal experience has been shaped by doubt. So when they shift, when they create space, when they step back, it feels sudden to you. But to them, it feels like a conclusion. Something they've been moving toward. Something they've been thinking through, even if the thinking was never grounded in reality. And that's why trying to fix it from the outside rarely works. Because the pattern was never external. It was internal. It was about how they process uncertainty, how they respond to discomfort, how quickly they move from feeling to thinking to concluding. And once that process has run its course, what they feel feels real to them, even if it doesn't reflect what actually existed. And that realization brings you to something important: release, not in a way that disconnects you from care, in a way that frees you from confusion. Because now you're not trying to decode every shift. You're not trying to prevent every doubt. You're not trying to manage something that happens inside someone else. Because you understand, you cannot out-explain overthinking. You cannot out-consistency internal doubt. You cannot out-presence a mind that is searching for problems. And once you accept that, you come back to what is yours: your experience, your clarity, your sense of what felt real before it was questioned. Because that matters, not as something to prove, as something to trust. Because the connection you experienced, the ease you felt, the simplicity that existed before the doubt was real, even if it didn't last, even if it was later reinterpreted. And once you trust that, you stop trying to rewrite it. You stop trying to align it with their conclusion. You let it be what it was, without needing it to match what it became. And that's where your clarity returns. Because now, you're not lost in their process. You're grounded in your own, in what you felt, in what you saw, in what was actually happening before everything became analyzed. And from that place, you don't just understand the pattern. You decide what it means for you, whether you stay in something where connection can be overthought into distance, or whether you choose something where connection is experienced, not constantly questioned, where presence doesn't turn into analysis, where clarity doesn't get replaced by doubt. And that choice, even if it's quiet, even if it's internal, is powerful because it's no longer based on confusion. It's based on awareness, on seeing exactly how something shifted and why. And once you see clearly, you stop chasing what was lost and start choosing what actually aligns. And if this put words to something you've experienced, comment, I saw the shift, because that moment, when you realize it wasn't sudden, it was built through quiet overthinking, is the moment everything makes sense. If you want to keep understanding these patterns at a deeper level, stay with the inner Odyssey, because once you see what's happening beneath the surface, you don't just experience connection differently, you choose it differently. And that's what changes everything.